I had been in Austin for a few days, visiting friends, and as someone who lived in Louisiana, the drive back home was always a long one. On my last day there, I posted a story on Instagram, as I often did, when I noticed a message from my old friend Tom. We hadn't spoken in years, but seeing his name brought a rush of memories from high school. His message was simple. "When are you leaving?" I replied, letting him know I was leaving that very day. To my surprise, he told me he lived just an hour outside of Austin, in the direction of my home. It had been so long since I'd seen Tom, and the idea of catching up was tempting. He invited me to stop by, and despite my initial hesitation, I thought, why not? It was a chance to reconnect, and besides, the drive didn't seem so bad if it meant a brief reunion. I plugged his address into my GPS, and it said I had about an hour and a half ahead of me. Not terrible, I thought. When I pulled up to Tom's house, I was immediately struck by how much it had aged. It wasn't run down, just old, charmingly so. The wooden porch creaked under my feet as I approached, and when he opened the door, the scent of aged wood and something earthy, almost like an old cabin in the woods, greeted me. It was a familiar feeling, one I hadn't realized I'd missed. Tom welcomed me with a hug, as if no time had passed at all. Some friendships, it seemed, stayed just as pure despite the years. Inside, the house was just as old as the outside. The furniture looked like it had been there since the 70s, and every step on the hardwood floor let out a soft creak. It was almost like stepping into a time capsule, a place that had seen decades of life but remained unchanged, solid and unbroken. We sat in his living room, catching up on everything that had happened since we last spoke. Whiskey flowed as the hours passed, and the warmth of the alcohol made the room feel smaller, cozier, and heavier all at once. Before I knew it, I had lost count of how many drinks I'd had. It was around 5 p.m., and time seemed to bend in that cozy house. We were talking and laughing like old friends again, and it felt like no years had passed since we last shared a conversation. Eventually, as the night grew deeper, Tom turned to me and with a hint of concern in his voice, said, "You've got a long drive ahead, man. Why don't you crash here tonight?" I hesitated for a moment. I wasn't in the best state to drive, and he was right. It was getting late. "Sure," I agreed, "but I'll take the couch." "Nah," Tom said with a grin. "I've got a spare room. It's nothing fancy, but it's better than the couch." That sounded good enough for me. We ordered Chinese food, and after a while, Tom led me down a short hallway to the spare bedroom. My head was already heavy from the alcohol, and I didn't pay much attention to the room itself. I remember the air was still, like the room hadn't been used in a long time. I didn't have time to fully take in my surroundings before I collapsed onto the bed, utterly exhausted. But something was off. It wasn't until much later that night, when I woke with a dry mouth and a head spinning from the alcohol, that I realized something was wrong. The room was pitch black, save for the faint glow of moonlight seeping through the blinds. That's when I saw it. In the far corner of the room, hanging on the closet door, was something. At first, I thought it was just a long black trench coat hanging on a coat rack, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized the shape didn't quite sit right. It wasn't just a coat. The upper part of it was broad, almost like shoulders, and the way it hung, it didn't feel like fabric. It felt like a silhouette. My heart began to pound. I didn't remember seeing that when I first stumbled into the room earlier, but I had been drunk. Maybe I had missed it. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself it was just a coat. It had to be, but I couldn't stop looking at it. I squeezed my eyes shut, took a deep breath, and forced myself to sleep. The discomfort gnawed at the back of my mind, but I eventually drifted off. Hours later, I woke again. This time, not from discomfort, but from a sound. A soft creaking like someone carefully stepping on an old wooden floor. My eyes snapped open. The room was now dimly lit, the first rays of dawn creeping through the blinds. I turned my head toward the corner, my stomach dropping. The coat was gone. I sat up so fast that my head spun. My body buzzed with a sickening mix of fear and leftover alcohol. My heart pounded in my chest as I scanned the room. There was nothing in the corner anymore, just an empty closet door. I threw off the covers and rushed to Tom's room, panic tightening my chest. He was snoring, completely unaware of the storm that was raging inside me. I shook him awake. It took a lot of effort, but he finally stirred, groggily rubbing his eyes. "The coat?" I said, my voice shaky. "The one on the coat rack in the spare room?" Tom blinked at me, confused. "What coat?" "The black trench coat," I said urgently. "The one that looked like a person. It was hanging on the closet door." Tom sat up, his face still sleepy but now serious. "I don't own a trench coat, man. I don't even have a coat rack in that room." I stared at him, my mind racing for some explanation, but his face was unwavering and a chill crept down my spine. "Come look," I insisted. Tom sighed, but got up and followed me back to the spare bedroom. I pointed to the exact spot where the coat had been. "It was right there," I said, my voice trembling. Tom scratched his head. "Are you sure you weren't just dreaming? Maybe you were half asleep." But I wasn't sure. I knew what I saw. I insisted we search the house, just to be sure. We searched every room, every closet, every corner. There was nothing. No coat, no signs of forced entry, nothing that could explain what I had seen. Tom eventually tried to convince me that it must have been some half-dream, some alcohol-fueled hallucination. I wanted to believe him. I didn't want to think of any other possibility. But that day, as the sun fully rose, I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, had been in that house, watching me while I slept. And I couldn't help but wonder if it had decided to leave before the morning came. The sun was fully up when I left Tom's house. We had said our goodbyes, but I could still feel the unease lingering in my chest. Tom, in his usual laid-back manner, had shrugged it off as a figment of my imagination, a trick played by the alcohol. But I knew what I saw. I knew it wasn't just a dream. The drive home was long, too long to distract myself from the questions swirling in my mind. I kept replaying the events over and over, the strange coat, the impossible silence that followed, and the eerie disappearance of it by morning. I tried to convince myself that Tom was right, that I had just been too drunk, too tired. But deep down, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something had been watching me that night. By the time I reached the Louisiana border, my thoughts were a mess of confusion and dread. The rural stretch of highway where the road seemed to stretch endlessly in front of me did little to calm my nerves. Every shadow along the side of the road looked like something lurking just out of sight. Every passing car felt like it could hold someone, something I couldn't quite understand. I told myself it was just paranoia, the aftermath of an unsettling night, but no amount of reasoning could quiet the unsettling feeling in my gut. The first few days after my return were spent in a haze of normalcy. I went back to work, resume my routine, but something was off. I kept glancing over my shoulder as I walked down the street. I avoided looking into any dark corners of my home, as if expecting to see something waiting there. Tom had messaged me once, asking if I made it home okay, but I hadn't replied. I didn't know what to say. How could I explain what I had seen? How could I put into words the inexplicable terror that had gripped me that night? It was a few days later when I received another message from Tom. This time, his tone was different. Distant, but still warm. "Hey man, hope everything's all right. You okay?" I stared at the message for a long time. Was I okay? The question felt heavy. No, I wasn't. But I didn't want to burden him with it. I didn't want to sound crazy. So, I replied simply, "Yeah, I'm good. Just a long drive, you know." Tom didn't press the matter, but something in his message made me uneasy. It was almost as if he knew. That night, I couldn't sleep. The walls of my room felt oppressive, like they were closing in on me. I kept staring at the shadows that stretched across the floor, wondering if they held something lurking just out of sight. A cold sweat broke out on my brow as I tossed and turned. I thought about the coat again, how it had hung there, waiting almost as if it had been a warning. I thought about the silence that followed its disappearance. It wasn't natural, that kind of quiet. It felt like the calm before a storm. And then, as if answering some unspoken call, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Tom. My heart skipped a beat as I read the words. "Hey man, you still there?" It was a simple question, but the timing of it sent a chill down my spine. I had been thinking about that night, and now Tom was reaching out, asking if I was still there. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I walked to the window and stared out into the dark night. The street outside was eerily still. The only sound, the distant hum of traffic on the highway. Everything looked so normal, so quiet. But something in me couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. A moment passed before I replied, "Yeah, just thinking." Tom's next message came almost immediately. About the coat? I froze. How did he know? I hadn't mentioned it. I hadn't told him a word about what had happened since I left his house. The suddenness of his message made my pulse quicken. What do you mean?" I typed, my fingers trembling as I hit send. His response came almost instantly. "I think you should come back. There's something I need to show you." That was it. No explanation, no details, just that one cryptic message. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced, torn between fear and curiosity. Part of me wanted to just forget the whole thing, push it all to the back of my mind, and pretend it had never happened. But the other part of me, the part that couldn't stop thinking about that damn coat, felt like I had to go back. I grabbed my keys without a second thought. When I arrived back at Tom's house, it was already dark again. The porch lights flickered softly, casting long shadows across the yard. I hesitated for a moment at the door before knocking. The wait felt endless, as if the world was holding its breath. When Tom opened the door, his expression was unreadable. He stepped aside, gesturing for me to come in. I followed him through the house, which, just like before, had the same old charm, the same smell of wood and time. But this time, everything felt different. The air was heavier, almost oppressive. As we walked past the living room, I noticed that Tom seemed to be avoiding my gaze. He led me down the same hallway to the spare room. The door was closed, but I could feel the tension in the air. "Tom," I said quietly, "what's going on?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he opened the door to the spare room. I stepped inside, and my stomach dropped. The room was the same, but now the closet door was open. There was nothing hanging from it. No coat. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was there. Something unseen. Something waiting. Tom closed the door behind us. And for a long moment, we just stood there in the silence. Finally, he spoke. "You weren't the first to see it," he said quietly. The words hung in the air, and my heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" "There's been a few others," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "People who've stayed in that room, they've seen things too, but no one ever talks about it." I looked at him, trying to make sense of his words. "What are you saying, Tom?" He sighed, his shoulders slumping, as if the weight of something he hadn't wanted to acknowledge had finally caught up with him. "I don't know what it is, man, but I think it's been here longer than either of us." The silence between us felt heavy, like the room itself was holding its breath. And then I understood. Whatever had been in that room, the thing I saw, the thing Tom had known about, it wasn't just a figment of imagination. It was real. And whatever it was, it had been waiting. But waiting for what? I stood there in the dimly lit spare room, the silence between Tom and me stretching out like a void. My mind raced, trying to piece together everything that had happened. The coat, the strange disappearance, the eerie feeling that had never truly left me. And now Tom's cryptic words, "You weren't the first to see it," hung in the air like an unanswered question, one I couldn't ignore. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Tom's face was tight, with something I couldn't place: regret, fear. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. Finally, I spoke, my voice barely a whisper, barely strong enough to break the silence. "Who else, Tom?" I asked, my voice betraying the unease that gripped me. "What do you mean?" "A few others." Tom took a deep breath, as if preparing to say something that weighed heavier than any explanation could lift. He turned away from me, walking over to the old wooden bookshelf that lined one wall of the room. His hand ran along the spines of books, but his gaze never left the floor. He was avoiding eye contact, and that spoke volumes. "I don't really talk about it," he said, his voice low. "But there have been people who've stayed here, friends, family, even strangers. They've seen things, heard things, but they don't stay long. Some leave before the night is over. Others, they just don't come back at all." A chill crawled down my spine, and I felt the room closing in on me, the walls pressing against my chest. I opened my mouth to ask more, but Tom turned back to me, his eyes now fixed on mine. They were dark, but there was something there, something behind them. A story, a truth. And it was one he had been avoiding, running from for longer than I cared to admit. "It's not just the coat," he continued, his voice steady now, almost as if the words had been waiting to be spoken for years. It. I stared at him, trying to comprehend what he meant. But he didn't elaborate. He simply shook his head, as if trying to erase the thought. He looked down the hallway, then back to me, a shiver running through him. "I didn't want you to know," Tom said. "I didn't want anyone to know, but you saw it. And now I think you're part of it." I felt a sharp pang of confusion. Part of it? What was he talking about? What did I have to do with this? I took a step forward, but Tom held up a hand, stopping me. "You don't understand yet," he said, his voice trembling. "But you will." I was about to ask what the hell he meant, but before I could speak, I heard something. A faint sound, like footsteps in the distance. Soft at first, but growing louder, closer. My heart skipped a beat as the realization hit me. Tom heard it too. His eyes widened, his face going pale. "It's happening again," he muttered, almost to himself. "What's happening again?" I asked, my voice rising. My heart pounded in my chest as the footsteps grew louder. They were unmistakable now. Someone was walking down the hallway slowly, deliberately. But there was no one else in the house. Tom stepped back, his face a mask of fear. Don't go out there," he said, his voice strained. It's not just the coat. It's always watching." I didn't understand. My body moved before my mind could catch up. I pushed past Tom, my steps quickening as I walked down the hallway toward the source of the sound. Every footfall echoed in the stillness of the house, each one louder than the last. The door to the living room was just ahead, but I couldn't see anything from where I stood. The hallway stretched on forever, the darkness at the far end swallowing any hope of seeing clearly. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow. It moved across the wall, long and distorted, like something that shouldn't have been there. It stretched in unnatural ways, like it was trying to reach out, to pull me in. I froze. The footsteps stopped. A cold gust of air swept through the hallway, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of wood, of old things left untouched for far too long. My heart pounded in my chest as I took a cautious step forward, reaching for the door frame. My fingers brushed against the cool wood, but before I could open it, I heard a voice, a whisper, soft and raspy like it was coming from the walls themselves. "Leave now." I jerked back, my body on high alert, my pulse racing. The voice was wrong. It wasn't Tom's, it wasn't anyone's I recognized. It was deep and guttural, like it had been in the house longer than I had, longer than any of us had. "You shouldn't have come back." I wanted to run, to scream, but I couldn't move. My feet were frozen to the ground, my body betraying me. The voice came again, louder this time, its presence filling the space, pressing against my chest, suffocating me. Tom rushed up behind me, his hand grabbing my arm, pulling me away from the door. "You have to go," he said urgently, his voice full of panic. "We have to leave now." But it was too late. The door swung open on its own, creaking loudly as if being forced by some invisible hand. I looked into the darkness beyond, my breath catching in my throat as I stepped into the living room. The air in the house felt thick, like it was alive, like it was breathing. Tom grabbed me by the arm and yanked me back, his face pale with fear. He turned to me, his voice breaking. "We should have left when we had the chance," he whispered. "It's never too late to run, but it's always too late to stop it." I had no idea what he meant. I had no idea what was happening. But as we ran toward the front door, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following us, something that had always been there, watching, waiting for us to cross a line we shouldn't have. As the door slammed shut behind us, I knew one thing for certain. Whatever it was, whatever had been watching, it wasn't done with us yet. We didn't speak as we hurried down the porch steps and into the yard. The air outside felt like a sharp contrast to the suffocating atmosphere inside the house, but it did little to calm my nerves. My heart was still pounding in my chest, and my mind raced with 1,000 questions, each one more terrifying than the last. Tom was already at his car, fumbling with the keys. He looked over at me, his face pale and drawn. There was no mistaking the fear in his eyes now. Whatever it was real, and it was not finished with us. "We need to get out of here," Tom said, his voice strained, almost desperate. I nodded, too shaken to speak. My mind was still reeling from everything I had just witnessed. The house, the voice, the shadow. Nothing made sense, but everything felt wrong. I wanted to run, to escape, but part of me felt like we couldn't outrun it. Not this time. We piled into Tom's car, the engine starting with a growl as he slammed his foot on the accelerator. The wheels spun in the gravel as we sped down the driveway, the house disappearing behind us in the rearview mirror. For the first few minutes, we didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. But soon, Tom broke the silence. "I should have told you earlier," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the engine. "I should have warned you." I looked over at him, confused. "Told me what?" Tom's eyes were fixed on the road, but his face was drawn, tight with something I couldn't place. "I didn't want to tell you about it. I thought if I ignored it, if I just pretended like it wasn't happening, it would stop. But it doesn't stop. It doesn't let you forget." "What doesn't stop?" I asked, my voice shaking. Tom swallowed hard, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. "The house. The thing inside it. It's not just the coat, man. It's something else. Something older. Something that's been there for years." I stared at him, my stomach churning. "What are you talking about? What is it?" Tom glanced over at me, his eyes wide with fear. "It's a presence, a spirit, a thing. I don't know what it is exactly, but it's been there for as long as I can remember. It used to be just the house, just the feeling of something watching. But then it started getting worse. People started seeing things, hearing things, the coat, the shadows, I don't know how to explain it. It's like it's feeding on our fear. And the more we ignore it, the more powerful it gets." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine as I processed his words. "What happened to the others? The ones who saw it?" Tom's jaw tightened. "Some left, but most, they never came back. It's like they disappear from the world. People stop hearing from them. They just vanish. And the thing is, once it starts with you, there's no going back." I was silent, trying to wrap my mind around what he was saying, but it didn't make sense. None of it did. I had to know more. "Why didn't you ever tell me, Tom? Why let me stay there?" "I didn't want to drag you into it," he said, his voice thick with guilt. "I thought, if I kept it to myself, if I didn't bring it up, maybe it would go away. But it never does. It gets worse. And now, I think it's after both of us." I felt the car swerve as Tom sped around a curve, his hands shaking on the wheel. My heart raced in response, the urgency of the situation hitting me all at once. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Tom's face was pale, his eyes wide with panic. "We get away. We keep moving. We don't stop. Whatever you do, don't look back." The words echoed in my mind as we drove deeper into the night. I had no idea where we were going or what we were running from, but I knew one thing for sure. Whatever Tom was saying, whatever was happening, it wasn't just some figment of our imagination. We weren't just running from a house anymore. We were running from something far more dangerous, something far more ancient. We drove for hours, the road stretching endlessly in front of us. Every turn felt like we were getting further from the nightmare that had gripped us, but it also felt like it was always just behind us, lurking in the dark, waiting for us to falter. Eventually, We found ourselves in a small, isolated town, far from the place we had just left. The tension in the car slowly began to ease, but there was no comfort to be found. I glanced over at Tom, who was still white-knuckling the steering wheel, his eyes glued to the road. He finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you believe me now?" I didn't answer immediately. I didn't know how to. Part of me still couldn't fully comprehend what we had just experienced. But as I sat there in the car, feeling the weight of everything that had happened, I realized something. It didn't matter whether I believed him or not. What mattered was that we were both in this together now. And whatever it wasn't done with us. "We should keep going," I said, after a moment, my voice steady. "We don't know if it's still following us." Tom nodded without a word. He didn't need to say anything. I could feel the same cold dread coursing through him, the same need to outrun something that couldn't be outrun. The night stretched on, endless and unyielding. But as we drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still with us, watching, waiting. And this time, I wasn't sure if we could escape.